Good afternoon. So hopefully you can all hear me. My name is Tim Flagg and I'm the CEO of UKAI, the trade association for AI within the UK. So I am delighted to be joining you this afternoon. We will be joined in just a minute with Baroness Thangam Debbonaire. She's on her way from the House of Lords as we speak. She sends her apologies not to be here on the dot, but we're expecting her in the next couple of minutes. So once we wait for Thangam to join us, I just wanted to give a bit of an outline for this discussion we're going to be having today. We have a roundtable coming up next month on the topic of taking responsibility for diversity and bias within AI. This is one of the areas that I think it's really important for us as an industry to all understand and take responsibility for this in order to find solutions. So we've got the roundtable coming up, which is in Parliament on the 23rd of April. Ahead of that meeting, Thangam and I have been discussing what the agenda would be for that event. And we realized that a lot of the discussion, a lot of the research, a lot of the context that we were going through would actually be very useful to share in a webinar like this. So that's the idea behind this, that we wanted to go through some of the context and really understand what are the challenges around bias. How does bias get there? What types of biases are there within AI systems? And then what can we do as an industry to find solutions and implement solutions? And ultimately, who is responsible for finding those solutions? I think, as you'll gauge from this, we think that as an industry body, we have to take some of that responsibility in finding those solutions as well. So just while we're waiting for Thangam to join us, let me go through a couple of the different types of bias that we're going to be looking at in more detail. So I think one of the main ones that people will have heard of is within the hiring and recruitment sector. That is a really major area where AI tools have been used for a number of years now, but there have been some instances where those have actually had some innate biases that then discriminated against certain groups of people. There's also been some very high-profile cases where it's been used within police and security, particularly with regards to facial recognition or criminal justice. That's another key area. Within healthcare and medical as well, that's an area where there's been biases as well. And there are many other areas, but the other big area I think is financial. So in terms of being able to understand an individual's credit file and then profile them based upon that credit file in order to give them credit from a credit card or loan provider, those types of things. So those are just some of the areas where there have been bias. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today will assume a bit of knowledge of how an AI system works. So let me just kind of break that down into very simple terms. The point of a lot of these models, whether they be predictive models or other types of models, is they will take in a data set. They will then use an algorithm to try and predict a certain outcome. And that prediction is based upon that data set. So, for example, if they are trying to predict whether somebody would make a good candidate for a job, then they're looking at all the data of what makes, in quotation marks, a good candidate. So they feed all the data in for what makes a good candidate. The algorithm extracts from that the characteristics of a good candidate, and then that gets fed in. So, and here is Thangam. Hello, Thangam, how are you?
Hello, sorry to be late, guys.
No
I
problem
just
at all.
run from A to B. It's nice to be with you all.
But now that you're here, let's sort of step back a little bit from the technical side and actually start thinking about why this is important in society.
I mean, it's important for so many reasons, but I think at the moment, if it gets badged under the diversity title, it's been given a bit of a battering lately because diversity and equality have been battered a little bit by public policy debates on the other side of the ocean, but that's having a ripple effect. And I think there are a lot of people who are going, hang on a minute, why do we need any of this diversity nonsense? And if you take the criminal justice example, for instance, there was a story a couple of weeks ago about the Sentencing Council requesting that there be a diversity, an impact report for any one of the number of diverse groups. Not that they would be let off their sentence, not that they would get a different sentence, but simply that they should have an impact assessment requested. Now that got translated into, oh, this is wokeness gone mad. So as a policymaker, one of my anxieties is that we may end up not taking seriously why bias actually does matter. And to take the medical example, in the Black Lives Matter time in 2020, when we were all on Zoom, just a bit like we are now, I was on a Zoom call then with a group of medical students who said that they were being taught medicine from textbooks that only used white people. And that doesn't work, for example, with a skin complaint or with a disease that presents with a different colour of skin. So they said for them, diversity and recognizing bias is about good medical treatment. So if we then translate that onto AI, when we are going to be using AI increasingly for healthcare, possibly for more for diagnosis, it's important that we're making sure that the data sets we're training from are diverse, not because it's a nice thing to do, but because that's how you get better diagnosis and better treatment plans. I mean, we've all probably heard of examples where research doesn't take into account diversity in medical research. And the danger there is that diseases get missed, or they are incorrectly diagnosed and therefore incorrectly treated. So there are real world reasons why it matters that we are alive to the likelihood of bias, and we are taking proactive steps to correct it. From the hiring example, where people have carried, in any case, offline, have always carried sort of ideas about what makes an ideal candidate here, which can lead to poor hiring decisions. And that can get replicated in AI if the pool of existing employees or the relevant data about who makes a relevant employee for a particular company already has a bias in it.
Yeah.
Because that's what will get replicated, or stands a high chance of getting replicated. And the key thing there is, do you want to miss out on talent simply because your AI is biased unwittingly in favour of a particular group or against another particular group? So I've just given sort of 3 sets of examples there: healthcare and medicine, policing, criminal justice, and hiring, where it matters because the real world consequence affects not just those from groups that might be biased against, but for all of us. If the medical research that our AI tools are using is biased, that affects everybody, because that can lead to misdiagnosis or poor treatment, which then has a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Hiring, do you want the best person? Policing, criminal justice, do we really want to end up replicating biases by training data on something which already has a bias inbuilt in it because of the different nature of populations and how they present to the criminal justice system?
I really like the way you frame that, because actually, you know, it's often seen as being something which is woke, which is being sort of thrown out in the US at the moment. And I think when you approach this, people do sort of classify talking about bias in that same regard. But actually, you went on then to talk about the commercial benefit in the broader sense of the word inclusion. And this is something that we talk about quite a lot, which is actually, it's not only the ethical thing to do, it actually makes commercial sense, because you don't want to miss out on that talent who is there and getting discriminated against, because that would be great people coming into your company. And you don't want to alienate your consumers and your customers, because then you're not going to have a business. So it's really important from a commercial perspective as we look at it. I think the other things to bear in mind here is that we're setting up guardrails, or we should be setting up guardrails for an industry. Things are moving really quickly in AI, and that's fantastic, you know, because companies
it's exciting.
But the challenge is always then, well, how do you actually police it, right?
Yeah.
Because at the moment, people are just kind of diving in without really looking at these consequences of some of that technology. So I wonder whether we could sort of look at sort of where. What are the next sort of steps, do you think, in terms of being able to take responsibility for this? I mean, we talked about some of those examples where there are things which are happening, where there are different types of bias. Let's talk about maybe some of the consequences. You know, what's been happening as a result of this within, let's say, within recruitment. We've talked about the outcomes there, that it means that we're not getting access to talent. But is it that we are going to just alienate a whole group of people within society as well, and that we're going to just perpetuate that sort of alienation in society?
The thing is, it doesn't make good commercial sense to alienate particular groups for reasons that are to do with personal characteristics about which they can do nothing. And so I would always start with, this doesn't make any commercial sense, but I would couple that with, it doesn't make any ethical sense to allow bias to creep in. But who has to take responsibility is complex, because we're at that early stage of the technology, as you say, but it's growing very, very rapidly. And I'm excited by that. I think it's a wonderful thing. There are all sorts of potential benefits, obviously, in AI developing rapidly. And we're already using it in ways that some people don't understand. I mean, my mother doesn't realise how many times a day she's using AI, because she doesn't really know what AI is, but she definitely is. So I think a question of responsibility is both the businesses, individual and collectively, taking responsibility for that. From an ethical point of view, yes, because we want AI businesses to be trusted. In any new frontier technology, there's always the danger that the public, who, let's face it, are your customers, one way or another, whether they are business owners or they're members of the general public using your services, they need to trust you, because, as we all know in business terms, once you lose trust, you lose customers. So I think building up that trust is really important, because people do have anxieties at the moment about, well, what is this AI? Is it going to be fair? I think being able to explain what you do is really important. So having businesses that are able to say to the public, not only is this how it works, but here's what we've done to make sure it's as fair as possible. And sometimes I think it's maybe better to talk about the language of fairness. Certainly colleagues who are thinking about their equality, diversity and inclusion policies getting a bit of a battering from policymakers in America, for example. I think if we talk about fairness and efficiency, that can sometimes get us somewhere better. So I think if we're thinking about what the solutions and who should take responsibility, I think business owners, financiers, people who are investing in new AI businesses need to ask those questions, because it makes good commercial sense, it builds up trust, builds up brand name reputation.
And what about the government and policymakers and lawmakers like yourself in Parliament? What responsibility and what can they do to help with the situation?
I strongly believe that government and politicians are there for their judgment, but their judgment has to be well informed. And for me to be able to regulate, for example, as a politician, I don't need to understand all the technical reasons, just as when I was responsible for regulating medicines, for instance. I don't need to know the technical reason why this medicine works and that medicine doesn't. I need to have trust in the system so that I can then, from that, develop and at least understand, if I'm a backbencher, what it is that I'm regulating, why, and what the consequences would be if we didn't, and what the consequences are if we do. So I think politicians have a responsibility to be asking the right questions. And it's one of the reasons I'm involved with UKAI, isn't because I'm an expert on AI, but I am an expert in being a policymaker, needing to know how to ask the right questions and get my colleagues to ask the right questions. And the right questions are, who benefits when this goes wrong? Who benefits when it works? Who is being left out that might be a good customer? That's a commercial decision. But from a politician's point of view, who's been excluded is a political question. That may be coterminous with who you don't want excluded as customers or as staff. We're there to represent the public. So we're also there as, if you like, a third position, which is, what does the general public think? What might the general public's view be of whatever piece of AI we're looking at? There were, over the last 10 years since I've been a politician, a lot of people who did not like the idea of their data, their medical data, even when anonymized, being put into a data set. And that was before AI. So my guess is, I remember when I first came across this, I was baffled, because at the time I was thinking, well, I'd quite like there to be more data on particularly nasty diseases that have either hurt me or someone I know. I'd like that to be done. But a lot of people did not trust the system then to handle their own data anonymously and not let it be bled into sort of insurance company data, which might go against them. They wanted to get insurance. They weren't trusting of the anonymity. So I think it's the role of politicians sometimes to be asking very irritating questions of new frontier technologies and saying to, say, AI, I don't need to know how the nuts and bolts work. I need to know that my constituents are not going to be adversely affected by what you're doing. And if there's a chance that they will, I need to weigh up should we regulate?
Yeah.
Those are the questions that Peter Kyle, Secretary of State for Digital and Science and Technology, he will be thinking about at the moment, that Ferial Clark, who's the Minister for AI, will be thinking about is, where should the guardrails be? And that is a responsible government thinking, do we need an actual regulation? Do we need a change of law? Or can we actually let the sector work out how to do this? And then we might put a ring around it.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, is an interesting question, because there are different levels to how it can be handled. And, the other thing is that AI is such a broad area. We've already said the different areas of society where it impinges upon. Within financial services, for example, I know the FCA is looking at how they can bring in fairness regulations. So they're doing AI regulation fairness audits now to look at the way in which some of these automated decision-making processes may be adversely affecting people. And they're sort of really looking into that. Within Parliament, the Treasury Committee is also looking at AI fairness as well. So that's now a key area there. But at what point does it have to end up becoming the role of those bodies as regulators versus the role of the industry? Do you think we've gone past the stage where we can say that the industry can self-regulate? That's one of the things that you often hear people in the industry saying, that it should be left to be able to self-regulate.
I think if self-regulation is to work, it needs to be demonstrable. So why do we need a law against murder? Right? Let's take an extreme example that's nothing to do with AI. You need a law against murder because when we relied on that people's sense of morality and ethics of murdering people is bad, people did. People still do, but we have a marker that says it is wrong and we consider it to be therefore against the law. We have made a law. So you track back here to something which is, the consequences are nowhere near as extreme as being murdered. But having rules is important if you can't rely on self-regulation. And as a politician, I don't want to put regulation in your way if I don't need to, but I need to be able to see that you don't need regulation. So any industry, that's the case. If we could rely on, for example, an industry that makes, toy cars, not using poisonous paint, most toy car manufacturers would not want to use poisonous paint because it would poison their customers. That would be a terrible thing. So once upon a time, we never felt we needed to, but then we found out that some companies, some parts of the world do use dodgy paint because they feel they can make a quick buck, get the toy out and get out of town and not take the blame. So it's a question of transparency. And I think that transparency and that explainability that companies have got to be able to demonstrate, or networks such as UKAI have got to demonstrate, is critical here. Because for the industry to make a good argument that I, or my colleagues actually, don't need to regulate, I've got to be able to trust that the constituents that members of Parliament represent, the MPs, aren't going to be adversely affected if we don't put in a rule. I'm genuinely, if we don't need to regulate, excellent, happy days.
Well, there's plenty of other things to be
lots of things to be regulated
as well, aren't there?
But you get things like, let's look at facial recognition bias. And you might think, well, that doesn't affect me. If I don't commit a crime, then there's no problem. If facial recognition is being used to track people in the streets after there has been a crime to detect whether or not a person A was in location B at time C, and there's bias in the facial recognition tool, that could lead to you being incorrectly identified as being person A in place B at time C. And so we've all, I think, to an extent, we need to notice the fact that just getting it wrong, nothing to do with whether your ethnicity or gender are a factor here, is bad, right? Because the consequences of that are bad. When you add in, there's information that Black women are more likely to be misidentified. That's a diversity problem, or it's an inclusion problem, or let's call it a fairness problem. I do not want, as a woman of colour, to be incorrectly identified as a person A in place B at time C, just because the AI tool that's doing the facial scanning hasn't got it right and recognises Black women less well than it recognises white women.
And it's 30 times more likely that a Black woman is going to be incorrectly identified by facial recognition than a white man. There was a survey that was done by, a study that was done by MIT, which is crazy when you think of it in those kind of terms. And then the reason that we got there, going back to how these predictive models work, is because the data sets which were put in were mainly white males. So they have a lot of training data. They're able to get accurate on them, but there wasn't very much data for Black females, and therefore that's what's led to the problem.
And we noticed that we know where these biases are likely to be because they're where they are already in non-AI data sets. data sets that haven't yet been used as training material. So as I gave the example earlier of the medical students who were saying to me, we have no textbooks that reflect the population that we are going to be serving. And it was because the majority of patients for this particular disease or that particular disease had been white men and women. However, that would lead to misdiagnosis for people of colour, and increasingly certain areas of the country had specific populations. So again, you needed to be able to reflect the range of populations that were in a particular place, otherwise you get misdiagnosis. Nobody benefits, by the way, if you get misdiagnosis. So if you're a white person thinking, well, that doesn't affect me, well, it does if someone's been misdiagnosed and is in the health service queue before you. Right? We all benefit from a fair system.
And an accurate system as well. It comes back to this one about the commercial, the productivity benefit. So within an organisation like that, then whose responsibility is it? I suppose what I'm thinking of here is that there are leaders in these organisations, whether it be the NHS or whether it be a commercial organisation. There are leaders, and somehow over the last 10 years, when these systems have been developed, when the systems have been put in place, leaders have not asked the right questions. I think that's how we got here. Now, I'd like to give them the benefit of the doubt because I've probably been in a leadership role in some of those companies myself, and it's often through ignorance. You just haven't realised the consequences of what you're building, partly because of that speed issue that I mentioned at the beginning, and you're just kind of blindly going into it. Now we have to take stock of that, and I think those leaders have to take responsibility. What do you think are the challenges around being a leader at the moment?
Knowing how to assess the accuracy, efficacy, and fairness of the data set. So if you're going to identify what is missing from this data set, where are the possible biases, you actually have to understand what the data set's doing and saying what information it's got in the first place. So making sure that you do, making sure that it is a reliable data set, making sure that it has been accurately tested, that it comes from good experimentation or documentation. That's really important. So where are your data sets in the first place? What are you training your AI model on? Depending on the function that you're trying to fulfill, whether that is, for example, you're developing a model, you're developing an AI product that's about assessment for creditworthiness. Let's say you're doing that. There are already biases offline before we even get to let's just digitize it, even if we're just going to put it all in a database, but we haven't got AI. Once you introduce AI on top of that, if you haven't looked at what the data set already has in terms of bias, then that's just going to be replicated, or the chance of it being unfairly replicated continue. Now, again, I know I keep coming back to this, but if your product doesn't assess the financial worthiness of clients correctly, and your business is providing a credit assessment tool for financial businesses, you are going to eventually get caught out. You will eventually find a false negative or a false positive amongst your AI model's decision. So that's not good business. You want it to be a good product. So yes, develop the new frontier technology. Yes, get out there and explore lots of different things. But the justification for regulation will come if I, as a politician, discover that your credit assessment AI tool is routinely giving false negatives and false positives that have affected my constituents. Now, the bank or the financial institution that's using that financial assessment, creditworthiness assessment AI might go, well, there's a few false negatives and a few false positives. I think I'll just factor that into my business model. But when those people come to their member of parliament and say, this is unfair, I've been unfairly discriminated against by this decision, that's a problem. At the beginning of the technology, of course, people won't necessarily know when AI has been used to make a decision about them. I think that's where we come back to the transparency and the contracting business needing to be transparent.
Exactly. Let's come back to that in a second. But I think it's really interesting what you're saying here about the leadership role, because it comes down to them not only taking responsibility for that, but also then having a sufficient understanding of the way the systems work. So actually being able to know what the data sets going in are and how it's making decisions. Now, part of what a lot of our members who are involved in training are saying is that they're going in and there's very different skill sets which leaders of organizations which are trying to do digital transformation or AI transformation, very different needs that they have. And I think this is where the industry can maybe sort of influence that and actually say, not only do those digital leaders need to be thinking about the organizational, the structural skills, they also need to be taking responsibility for understanding how these systems work and the impacts that it'll have on diversity and bias as well. I've just seen a couple of questions come in on the chat, so we will be coming to some questions. We'll leave a couple of minutes at the end to come back to questions. But yeah, I wanted to sort of also look at what you think the solution would be to being able to try and get more representation in the industry. We've talked about leadership. One of the worrying stats which we heard a couple of weeks ago when we were talking with Baroness Fox was that there's still the representation of women in leadership roles in tech. It's gone backwards, and that's within tech broadly. Within AI, representation of women is even lower. It's like something like 20%. It's terrible. And then if you look at other different types of representation within the tech sector, there aren't there. That's at the leadership level. I think if you look at the developer level, it's probably similar in terms of the male skew there. So that means that going in, the people who are hands-on actually building not just the AI models and the tools, but the software, the whole website, everything, have a very skewed view of the world. They are less likely to be able to identify some of these problems, and they won't have a personal experience of those. So how do we, I know it's a big question, but how do we start to find solutions for that?
Yeah, there's nothing inherently stopping a group of men who are running a tech company going, hang on a minute, there's something missing here. What is it? Right now, there's nothing stopping them noticing that that's missing in their staff pool. But even if that's not the case, there's nothing stopping men being the ones to ask the bias questions. Is there any part of our data that might be biased? Is a reasonable question for any leader to ask, whether they are a man or a woman, whether they are white or a person of colour, because you want a good product. So I'd say, first of all, and I would say this, step up. If you are not from the biased against groups, there's no reason on earth why you shouldn't use your position of leadership to be asking those questions. I don't think we should rely, although of course I do think it's important that we have diverse hiring, because that's how you get a better pool of talent. And if you are noticing that your staffing decisions are mainly from one particular demographic group, you might want to ask yourself what that says about your own biases, which again, it's not just about ethics, it's about good hiring decisions. You are cutting off a pool of talent if you are routinely hiring people only who look and think like you. Now, it shouldn't just be down to the women in the room to go, hang on a minute, this data set's not working for women. Perfectly possible for men to point that out as well, right? However, if you have fewer women or no women in a team, yes, it does make it less likely that somebody will go, hang on a minute. I would love to be in a room where I don't have to be that person. I'd love it if I was one of the 2 or 3 women in a group of 10, and it was the man that said, "Hang on a minute, I think our data set," or whatever it might be. Various things that I do, or a recruitment panel. If it wasn't me that had to say, "I think that's a bit of a problem there."
Yeah,
I think it would be a good idea if all leaders saw this issue of fairness. Like I said, EDI has become a bit toxified as a term. I still like it, but I know lots of people don't. It's about fairness, but it's also about good commercial sense. Good commercial sense says, as a leader, who am I not including in my hiring decisions? Who am I excluding in my data mining and my data training? What is it that the research that I'm getting my AI model to train on, what is it doing that replicates a bias? Or if it doesn't replicate a bias, how do I know that? How can I test that? Everybody should be asking those questions because it makes good commercial sense, as well as it being a question of ethics.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think it comes down to this kind of idea that we keep coming back to, which is how do we build trust and how do we actually make a successful business where the consumers trust our businesses.
Yeah.
And that's one of the kind of key things here, that the concept of diversity has got this notion, this connotation of being very woke at the moment. But actually, we need to reframe that as actually, it's not about being woke. It's about how do we lead successful businesses and make those businesses very successful. How do we engage with different communities? And if we want to do all of those things, then leaders really have to be aware of all these challenges, not seeing it as a sort of a hassle or a tax, but as you say, being very proactive. And I think on the sort of the male men can be allies to women in the room as well.
Should be,
yeah,
really. You know, you've all got mothers.
Yeah,
quite a lot of you've got sisters, and quite a few of you've got wives or
and
girlfriends
daughters. Yeah,
and daughters.
Yeah.
You know, you want that world too. It's there for you too. There is enlightened self-interest in all of these questions of fairness.
Yeah,
enlightened self-interest says to me, I want an AI model that's working fairly and ethically, not just because I'm a nice person. I think I am, but you know, not just for that reason, but because I want to know it's going to work. I want to know that it's going to give me good decisions.
Exactly.
As an MP, if I'm using AI, I want to know that what the information I'm getting out is good information.
Yeah, accuracy. And as you know,
accuracy really matters.
In data, that's one of the things that, you know, data scientists are obsessed with accuracy. And you know, if you can reform the question in terms of, well, actually, the way these predictions are being made now is on an incomplete set of data, and therefore the output is inaccurate. Suddenly, it starts to actually have a kind of a meaning. So I think all of these things really they have a root in balancing and fairness, the way in which we want these businesses to operate in the future, and successful businesses.
Because you can be a good data scientist and produce data that is completely accurate, and yet when used to train an AI model on, can produce the biased result if, say, your research has been purposively only on one particular demographic group. That's fine. You can produce really good data. But if there aren't equivalent data sets on other demographic groups, an AI model that's using it for, say, diagnosis in healthcare is going to get you false positives and false negatives if it's not going to pick up differentials in how a medical condition might present.
Could I ask a question which I think has come up and may come up in the roundtable as well, which is diversity is a very big term now, and inclusivity as well. There are lots of different types of group, and you start to sort of say, you know, we've talked about quite high level groups. We've talked about men and women. We've talked about people of color, you know, and people who are white. Those different groups, they're quite high level groups. But if you start to actually look at it, there's a myriad now of different communities who feel that maybe when we talk about DEI, that they should be represented here as well. It starts to then become very difficult if we're trying to balance all of those different groups. How do we draw the line between saying, well, we can try and make sure we're getting female representation, but we can't really, there aren't enough people down here in these micro groups down here to balance it. How do we draw a line over where we do that?
Well, I think when it comes to what the output of an AI model is, this isn't about drawing a line, it's actually about making good product. So we've strayed a little bit into hiring decisions, which I think is important. And bias in AI includes hiring decisions. And yes, sometimes it can be really difficult. But I mean, I'll give you as an example, 1 in 100 people, possibly more, is on the autistic spectrum and has an autistic spectrum disorder. And people with autistics on the autistic spectrum are disproportionately likely, even if they have an equivalent degree, they are disproportionately more likely to be or underemployed. That means that employers are missing out on their talent. In order to spot that that's happening, asking questions is important, monitoring it is important, but being open to people telling you what their specifics are is also important. And then if you notice that you've got a bias in your hiring, spotting for yourself, actually that means that I'm missing out on a particular bit of talent. Is there anything about my hiring practices that might be putting off this particular group? Now, that's diversity in its broadest HR sense. When it comes to AI, asking the questions about what biases might your AI be introducing inadvertently very often has to be part of the product development process, because it makes better product.
Yeah,
it's seeing it as a commercial imperative, I think, is critically important. And I think that's where, when you say, well, where do you draw the line? Why would you want a model that isn't efficient? Why would you want an AI product that isn't going to give you the best quality decision-making support if you are a doctor, if you are in the criminal justice system? You want to know, as the criminal justice system, the NHS, that the use of AI that you've been given is going to give you good information.
Yeah, I suppose where I was going at was, you know, in terms of, we could look at the population, 50% of the population, roughly male, female. So that's a large.
Let's start with that.
Yeah, that's a large subset.
Let's start with that.
But if you start then looking at some of the smaller communities of people who would feel kind of left out, then there might be only 0.01%.
Yeah, but the thing is, Tim, it isn't about making people feel left out, although that's part of it. failing to be able to diagnose a disease because you've only got a very small sample from a particular demographic group isn't about them feeling left out. It's about them being not diagnosed with a serious illness.
Yeah.
So it's not about whether or not I think the reason to do this, and it's important to internalize, isn't because somebody might say, I feel left out, although that could be an issue. It's because you're not going to give such good product.
But I'm not saying that they will feel left out. I'm saying that in the data set that we're building, should we include a 0.01% for this particular subgroup?
Well, you're going to have to oversample with very small subgroups because there's less data about them because there's fewer of them, and therefore to give you decent data, you're going to have to oversample.
Yeah.
So it's not a question of do I reflect the UK population? It's also a question of, well, it depends what the purpose is. If you know, and empirically we do know that there is bias in a particular issue. Let's go back to the healthcare example I gave. If you know that that is already presenting in different ways for people of colour and for different ethnicities of people of colour and white people, then you're going to have to draw quite a large sample, I would have thought, you're the experts, in order to be able to correct for that disparity. Because let's say you've got 100 people and 70% of that population is white and 10% of that population is Afro-Caribbean, 10% is Pakistani origin, and 10% of it is Somali. Okay, so if you have a very small number in your data set about those three subpopulations, it's going to make it harder for you to provide decent quality output.
Yeah.
So I'm not the AI genius here. Yeah. You guys are, and you'll know how to do it. All I'm saying is the right question to ask is this the way we've structured our model to mine the data and use it and interpret it? Is it likely to give us answers which are not a true and accurate reflection of reality?
Yeah, no, I think that's useful. I was just trying to get into the sort of the how. At what point do we start?
I don't know.
I know we don't have
well, I think it depends on what it is you're doing.
Yeah.
So particular illnesses. Let's say you've got an illness that doesn't affect men, or you've got an illness that doesn't affect women.
Yeah.
Those are the questions you're going to ask yourselves.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's look at a couple of the questions we've had because I see a couple of things coming on the chat. So see what we've got there. Thanks, Tom. Says enjoying the conversation. Bringing a new nuanced type of bias in AI, and that's a lack of neuro-affirming perspective of autism, which is extremely important as I'm working with a notable autism centre. I'd love to bring this into the conversation. And next week is Global Autism Day. Yeah.
And then Sean said, hire on merit, that's all that's required. And I absolutely agree, Sean. The difficulty we have with hiring on merit is that there is an internal myth that we tell ourselves that that's what we're doing. And if we don't at least examine who we're excluding, if we've got a very monoculture in a particular team, you might want to ask yourself whether there is someone who is just as equal merit, if not higher merit, who doesn't fit the personality profile we're used to hiring. So yes, of course you should hire on merit. If only everybody was completely unbiased, that would be fine, but that's not the case. And we know that from blind testing or where you have got research on shortlisting where people who've got equivalent qualifications and equivalent experience are equally well hired if there's no data about their gender or ethnicity, and not if there is. So, I mean, that's a very clunky way of saying, Sean, yes, I agree. What I don't want you to do, what I don't want anyone to do, is unwittingly not hire on merit by having a picture in our heads about who makes a great AI person, who doesn't make a great AI person, who makes a good tech scientist, who doesn't make a tech scientist.
And I can't remember the name of the tools now, but I've used a couple of tools when we've been hiring in the last couple of years where it's actually blind. So someone sends in their CV, they upload their information, but they answer two or three questions. That then goes in, and we as a recruitment team then would each be reviewing the answers to the questions blind as just numbers, and we all score them, and then that goes back, and then we see the candidates afterwards and see who scored the most.
And that's how you reduce the chances that you're not hiring on merit.
Yeah.
Because you aren't responding with your own subjectivity, you are responding with as much objectivity as you can give yourself.
Yeah.
Part of the challenge is that AI models are trained on historical data. Yeah, I mean, it's a good example to give is the antiquated views of autism. But also there are other examples of antiquated data or historical data. So that's one of the leadership questions to be asking, isn't it?
I think that's right. And we've got the roundtable coming up where we're going to be looking at this in a lot more detail. What do you think are going to be the most pressing issues for MPs going into this? So we've got Dan Aldridge, who's an MP over in Somerset. He also is the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on inclusion So I'm wondering, sorry, digital inclusion. And I'm wondering what the sort of issues are that Dan's going to be sort of interested in looking at, and what that sort of APPG is going to be interested in. Do you think they have this kind of wide view? Is part of our role in that roundtable to expose them to all these different types of diversity?
I think raising their awareness of why it matters commercially as well as ethically, positioning it as an issue of fairness and efficiency and commercial viability is important, but also remembering that members of Parliament in the House of Commons are elected to serve and represent their constituents. So thinking about what problems might their constituents have in life if there is bias in the training of a particular AI model.
Okay.
So think about those things. What's likely to be in that MP's postbag?
Yeah.
And I would say there might be fears. There might be nothing. That's the other thing, is you don't always get, your constituents don't always know that problem A is looming. They'll be thinking about problem B that's hitting them right there this week.
Yeah. So let's spend a bit of time looking at what some of the solutions are.
Oh, you know more than me about this. Come on. What are the solutions, Tim?
Well, that's what I wanted to get into, right? Because, I think the first step is trying to understand the problem. And then the second step is taking responsibility of it, which is what we're trying to do here. Now we need to actually get into, well, whose responsibility is it to drive forward these solutions? There are quite a few solutions out there. So I know that one of the main things which is getting a lot of attention at the moment is training data. So being able to get diverse training data in. We touched upon that a little bit already, and it was to the point which you made before, which is if you know there are underrepresented groups, just make sure you have enough data for them to be able to then ensure.
Or as Tom said, if it's historical data, so checking where the data was, where it's come from, and what it's using.
Exactly. And there's, I know IBM have been doing some work in this space now to actually also build into their algorithms the ability to check for bias. Good. So from a mathematical perspective, they can start to look at that to find that bias, detect it, and then mitigate for it as well. I think there's also a number of bodies now which are starting to set up ethical practice and certification. So one of the ones that we're quite interested in is the AI for Good initiative, where there are, this is like a worldwide group that's coming together to look at how they can support ethical behaviour. What we're looking at in the UK is through UKAI trying to almost set up a kite mark for organisations that meet these ethical standards and responsible standards. It shouldn't be too hard to do, right? It's just asking the questions we've been asking today, which is making your predictions more accurate. So from a data science perspective, that's what we do anyway. We want to do that. And from the point you're making, it's also good commercial sense. If you want your business to be successful, you want to do these things anyway.
And if you want to be able to continue to say, we don't need to be regulated, we're self-regulating, that you have to be able to demonstrate that. And that, to come back to what the politicians might want in a round table, is to know that someone has thought this through, someone has thought about what the pitfalls might be, what the consequences would be that are unfair or dangerous or risky, and what they've done to reduce that.
Yeah, exactly. We've touched upon transparency as well. I think that is a big thing, and this cuts across all of the different areas of AI, right? We were talking about copyrights not so long ago, and we're looking at actually the challenge there is within a lot of the generative AI models, it's a black box. So you don't know what happens to the materials when they go into that black box, and then there's an output. Exactly the same challenge here, that there is a lack of understanding, but also a lack of transparency into what's happening there. And there's a sort of a movement, I suppose you call it, which is explainable AI, XAI, which is essentially saying that they should have an understanding and transparency of what's happening. So that if somebody does find that a system, and the output from a system has been biased against them, let's say a financial decision has been made, they can then trace that back and understand how that decision has been made. It sounds like a very simple thing, but it's just sort of redress. It's almost like freedom of information for that individual. So I think there's a number of things there which would really help. And we've also talked about human in the loop already, although we haven't called it that. But this is the concept that actually leaders and people in the development teams need to be involved in overseeing what the models are doing. It shouldn't just be left to a completely automated system.
Isn't that also how you deal with the reputational risks that there are at the moment of the general public, your customers, thinking that this is all about machines taking over. And if you have that as a principle, human in the loop, and you explain it and you explain why it matters and you make sure that you understand why it matters, that it's not just a token thing, that's really helpful. It's really important for building trust.
Mm. Absolutely. And I think as we move forward, that's what consumers should be asking for more, is that understanding not only the transparency, but also that there's some oversight. There is that human in the loop there.
Yeah.
The regulation issue is good.
It's tricky, isn't it?
And we're going to keep coming back to it, I think, aren't we? It's very much in flex at the moment. You have the UKAI Act, and the EU have also just kind of published the latest version of their regulations, which are well, we're still sort of going over and looking at what they mean. But on the other side of the Atlantic, we've got the US, who are ripping up lots of regulations. Yeah. And in fact, we've got an event next Friday where we're looking at the transatlantic differences between regulation in the UK and the US and what that might mean. But I think the sense I'm getting from government is that it's very hard to regulate at the moment because they don't know what's happening with that geopolitical space, and they want us to see where the dust settles before they choose to go more.
Yeah, and I get that. I think the thing is, if you are arguing for less regulation or no regulation, which does seem to be an argument that's coming, not just in AI. I mean, people make that argument all over the place in all sorts of industries, both the well-established ones and the new frontier ones. If you make that argument, you are betting on not having a disaster happen with the fact that you don't have any rules. Okay? So lack of regulation or lack of enforcement of regulation is what ends up, say, in the food industry, causing outbreaks of food poisoning. If people don't obey the rules, if they're not keeping to the hygiene rules, they're not doing the health and safety, which people make fun of, well, guess what happens if you don't operate healthy and safe practices in a restaurant or in a food processing environment? People get sick. And that's why we have rules about health and safety. So if we want to make sure that that's what we're doing with AI, I don't want to stifle innovation, but I think there's an interesting question about whether or not the AI industry is capable of going, actually, it makes commercial sense for us to abide by certain standards, even if you don't need me to impose them as a politician or my colleagues in House of Commons and government. If you don't, that's great. I don't know a politician who wants to stifle innovation, right? What we do want is to make sure that the members of Parliament with constituents in the House of Commons want to make sure that those constituents are well protected from harm.
And I think that's a challenge to the industry, right? Which I'm glad you're putting it down, because you made the point quite powerfully before with that comparison to why do we have laws around murder.
Yeah.
And it's frankly, the challenge to the AI industry is get your house in order.
Yeah.
Do good and ensure you're doing good. And if you do that, then we don't need to be having draconian laws.
And be able to demonstrate it. And nobody wants a draconian law. That's just really bad business.
Yeah.
People end up with bad draconian laws if a disaster has happened. So for every industry, imagine the worst disaster that could happen if it all goes wrong. Why it would make sense for you commercially to avoid that, but why it would make sense politically is so that I don't come along as a politician or my colleagues in government or the House of Commons and say, right, up with this, we will not put, this disaster has happened, we're now going to regulate you.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges here is that there's very different approaches to this depending on the subtopic, right?
Agreed.
So, with some topics, when we're talking about, say, whether it be copyright, or whether it be protecting children online, or whether it be now what we're talking about here in terms of diversity and bias, the big tech companies will have very different views on all those things. So I was just talking about some of the big tech companies here who are really leaning into diversity, and that's great. So IBM have done some great work on that. Google have done some great work on that. OpenAI have done some great work on that. They're all sort of investing in this. They seem to really want to find solutions. They don't, to your point, then that they might not need to be regulated here, but then on other areas, it's not working, and maybe that's where the regulation comes in. So it's a good sort of litmus test.
It is, and I think sort of the question of what happens in our relationship with America, if America lays down a gauntlet and says no regulation, otherwise we're not interested. There's a world in which that argument makes sense, but that is a world in which we've thought through what are all the worst possible consequences that could happen, and we've thought about they're very unlikely to happen, but if they do happen, it's an absolute disaster. Two, they're quite likely to happen, but it's only a modest crisis, and that we've worked out that matrix and that balance for your AI companies' own commercial sakes, as well as for trust in products and public harm, public good. And that's the gamble that I think deregulators in the States are taking, is that because it's a new frontier technology, they may not really be able to think through what are the possible consequences of saying, let's have no regulation. I think that AI and AI technologies and, AI businesses are clearly capable and competent at thinking through what are the risks of this going on, because that's what you do in any business, isn't it? You think about, what if this goes wrong? What am I going to do to reduce the chances? In this case, having a clear understanding of what that might look like is really important if you want to convince politicians we don't need regulating. Because we aren't all going to do things in the same way as America. We might. EU, as you said, have taken one approach, but they argued amongst themselves about which way to go. And that's good. That's healthy democratic debate.
No, and I think you're right that there's a lot more we could get into on the transatlantic debate, on the regulation debate, on all of those things. I'll come to some questions in a minute. So if you do have any more questions for us, please just put them into the chat box there. But just as you were talking, it made me want to reiterate this point around the difference between the big tech companies and the rest of the companies in the AI sector, because it's almost, the analogy I use is talking about chip manufacturers and the devices that use those chips. So not many people buy chips, but we all buy devices. We all buy laptops, computers, cars, mobiles, all of those things that use chips, right? And it's the same thing here with the big tech LLMs who are building the models. The rest of the AI industry are buying from them. And then those thousands of businesses are then selling those products, those devices to the consumers. So I think that's the industry, those who are our members. And our responsibility is to hold those chip makers, not the actual chip makers, as in case you're listening, chip makers, but the big tech, the LLMs, hold them to account and say, actually, well, we are the ones who are interfacing and trying to build trust with the consumers. And we want to be responsible so that we can build businesses.
I think the other thing is to keep an eye on the prize. I remember several years ago when somebody first explained to me how AI could help make better diagnosis for breast cancer. And I thought that's one of the most common diseases that kills women. And I asked, and I said, it can also help make better diagnosis for prostate cancer, one of the diseases that is most likely to kill many men. So who wouldn't want to use a tool that's going to make it more effective, more accurate, and possibly quicker and sooner to diagnose what can be a very deadly disease, and that's cancer. So we've got great promise here that medical diagnosis will be better, more accurate and earlier, that treatment plans can therefore be better, that are more likely to cure you quickly and with fewer side effects, that we can do research that underpins new treatments for cancer. If you just look at health and nothing else, the future that AI can give us is incredibly exciting. And if we look at other things such as creativity or handling content moderation in online chat sites, there's so much potential there for how we can be doing more and more interesting things if we deal with this little problem over here or this big problem over here, which AI can do more efficiently, more effectively and quicker than we can ever do. So I have huge excitement about what the future holds with AI in it. I just think it's in the AI industry's interest, as well as mine and yours and every individual person out there, that's done with maximum respect for fairness as a good idea for a moral reason and for commercial reasons.
Great. Let's come back in a minute to try to capture some of these points to start building the agenda for that roundtable we're going to have in a couple of weeks.
Let's do that.
But let's look at the questions that come in. So we've got another more comment, I think, from Tom here, talking about another solution. For example, the Autism Support Centre is looking if we can build our own AI model that we can then train to have a more neuroaffirming perspective of autism. So when we create training materials, they have embedded our mindset. Absolutely. And I think that's what we're starting to see now as well. I was at a really interesting dinner last night where people were talking about open source, and rather than having big LLMs, like sort of open AI, which is doing everything, actually federating it out into smaller models and being able to train up those different models in different ways on different data sets to be able to reflect the diversity, whether it be autism or whether it be different racial, ethnic backgrounds, etc.
How would that translate into a real world benefit?
Well, number one, it would mean that you're able to collect all those different data sets that we mentioned, that we wanted to have better data sets
Right.
for the more minority groups. You can actually build those. People start to worry when you're building up data sets of individuals with a certain characteristic that, well, what else are you going to be using those for?
Yeah.
And so it's a security privacy sort of issue. If you're then collecting them in federated, as in distributed across.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Then it means that, maybe I've got an institution over here where I keep data about South American people, and you've got a database over there. You keep people who've got like neurodiversity, and everyone's got it. Then we pull them together into one training set that can actually be formed into one model, rather than at the moment all of that data has to sit with one big model,
really
which is trained by OpenAI. So I think this open source model that I'm hearing more of, they see that as being kind of the future of building these models. It's not just one big company, it's actually spread across, the data spread across, and the processing, the compute is spread across lots of different centers as well.
That's interesting.
Yeah. But it answers a number of questions. So watch this space, because I think we should do a follow-up on that in its own right. And I know the open source community are very keen to be pushing it. There's a number of sort of implications there as well.
I think I'm hoping that our roundtable in a couple of weeks' time, what we're also perhaps able to identify is things that we haven't yet thought of, where bias is already producing inefficient or ineffective or unfair responses in the offline world. How can AI actually help proactively be an assistance to mitigate against bias and unfairness and inefficiency in the offline world? I think there's that proactive good that AI can offer, and being able to spot bias in an offline world. Bias that is unproductive, commercially risky, or immoral, but also possibly medically dangerous, those sorts of things. I think AI properly harnessed, a bit like the debate we're having about copyright, I think that AI properly harnessed can be part of the solution. Actually.
And that's it. And that's what we should be doing, is actually proactively trying to find solutions rather than being on the back foot and having to sort of, try and solve problems that we didn't want to make in the first place.
But it's a bit like, why did I first get turned on to the idea of AI being my friend? It was when I could see a real world solution to a real world problem that AI could make better. So breast cancer affects 1 in 8 women. If there's a tool, whatever it was, I mean, if it had been a set square and a ruler that could give me better diagnosis rates earlier, quicker, and more effectively for breast cancer, I'd have gone for it. But the fact that AI can use data and actually help solve a problem, deal with an unfairness, identify an issue earlier, better, and more effectively is brilliant.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
We're nearly out of time. So if there's anything else you want to wrap up with?
Yeah, well, let's talk about what we think the key points should be for the agenda for our roundtable. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the different types of bias. So I think that's probably quite a good place to start. What do you think comes next?
Why does it matter?
Okay.
Why does it matter for the AI companies, first and foremost? Why should it matter to you, AI companies? And why does it matter for the wider public or other stakeholders that are specific to the wider public? A particular profession, for example. What can the benefit be if we identify the potential for bias and correct it?
Yeah.
But also, I think identifying that another stage is then what are without going into too much technical detail, what technical things need to happen in order that AI businesses themselves can self-regulate effectively?
Yeah.
I think that would be a good place to go after that.
And then do you think whose responsibility, or what institutions, or
I think so, but maybe also what can AI do to help correct bias in the offline world?
Yeah.
What examples of societal bias that matter to people can be helped or prevented by AI? So it's not just how can AI itself avoid being biased, it's how can AI itself deal with and correct for bias in the real world that has real world consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. That's been really useful. We've covered such a lot of ground there. I hope that was useful for you as well, our audience there. This is us setting out the agenda for that more in-depth discussion where we're going to bring together our members, policymakers, and experts to really get into a lot more detail. So the event's on the 23rd of April. You can find more information at ukai.co ukai.co/diversity. That's ukai.co/diversity. And yeah, it's been great to talk all this through.
Thank you,
it's the beginning of a conversation, I think.
Yeah, it's
we're
really
going to go back
interesting.
to. So thank you very much.
There's a lot to talk about.
Thanks very much, Thangam.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim.
And thanks very much to our audience. See you again soon. Thank you.